You
He
will stay
turned
there
on the
until you
outdoor
understand
shower
what
in the
you've
middle of
done.
December
Ethan,
and
and
forced his 7-month
please,
pregnant
the
wife
baby.
to stand beneath the freezing water. He watched her
I have a
collapse.
feeling we were
He watched her
destined to
skin
meet
turn
tonight.
blue. He watched her beg for mercy
Is that your
while their
standard
unborn
opening
child
line,
kicked
Mr.
desperately
Miller?
inside her womb. And he did nothing. For 11 minutes, Ethan Miller stood with his arms crossed, watching his wife die in his own backyard. He believed no one would ever know. He believed his money made him untouchable. He believed she had no one left to protect her. He was catastrophically wrong. Because what Ethan did not know was that his wife was wearing something hidden beneath her sleeve, something her father had given her, something that was already sending a silent scream for help into the night. And 12 miles away, 6 armored vehicles were about to tear through his gates. But that is only the beginning. Because what investigators found inside his safe would reveal a secret so dark, so twisted, that it would destroy everything he had ever built. Stay with me until the end, because the truth that unfolds is more shocking than you can imagine. The night Ethan Miller forced his pregnant wife into that freezing shower, he believed he was untouchable. He believed his money could bury any secret. He believed she had no one left to protect her. He was catastrophically wrong. But to understand how one of America's most powerful CEOs destroyed himself in a single night, we need to go back 18 months to the moment Caroline Hayes made the worst decision of her life. Stay with me, because the truth that follows is even more shocking than you can imagine. And by the end, you will understand why some monsters deserve to fall. Caroline Hayes was 32 years old when she met Ethan Miller. She was a pediatric nurse at St. Michael's Hospital in Boston. The kind of woman who worked double shifts without complaint, brought homemade soup to elderly patients who had no family, and genuinely believed that kindness could fix broken things. Her father, Richard Hayes, had built a small but successful security consulting firm after retiring from the military. Nothing flashy, just steady contracts, protecting corporate executives, and the occasional celebrity. Carolyn grew up middle class, grounded, and fiercely independent. She paid her own way through nursing school. She drove a 10-year-old Honda. She measured wealth not in dollars, but in the number of children she helped heal. She met Ethan at a charity gala her hospital hosted in the spring. He donated $2 million that night. $2 million. The number still echoed in her mind weeks later. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in her work with sick children. Not her appearance, not her connections, just her. Carolyn would later tell investigators that she missed the early warning signs because Ethan was so generous in public. She did not know then what experts now call love bombing. That is the term for the excessive flattery and gifts that abusers use to create emotional dependency before the control begins. If you ever find yourself overwhelmed by someone's attention in a new relationship, if the gifts feel too extravagant too soon, if the compliments seem rehearsed rather than genuine, pay attention. Your instincts are trying to tell you something. The courtship was a whirlwind. Within 6 months, Ethan proposed with a ring worth more than her annual salary. Her father, Richard, had reservations. They sat together at his kitchen table one evening, the same table where she had done homework as a child, and he looked at her with worried eyes. "Something feels rehearsed about him," Richard told her, "like he is playing a role." Caroline dismissed it as overprotective parenting. Richard was a security expert. He saw threats everywhere. That was his job. She loved him for caring, but she was a grown woman capable of making her own decisions. She married Ethan 8 months later in a ceremony that cost more than most people's houses. 300 guests, imported flowers, a 12-piece orchestra. Her father walked her down the aisle with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. The abuse started on their honeymoon. It began small, so small that Caroline almost convinced herself she was imagining things. Ethan criticized how she dressed for dinner. He monitored her phone, asking who she was texting, why she was taking so long to respond to his messages. He isolated her from friends by scheduling important dinners whenever she made plans with them. By month 6, he controlled her bank access. Every purchase required his approval. Every expense was questioned. By month 9, he had convinced her to quit her nursing job. "You do not need to work anymore," he said with a smile that looked like generosity but felt like a cage. "Focus on being my wife." By month 12, she was not allowed to visit her father without Ethan's permission. Richard Hayes, the man who had raised her alone after her mother died, who had taught her to change a tire and balance a checkbook and believe in her own strength, was now someone she needed permission to see. Her best friend from nursing school, Diane, once joked that Ethan had more red flags than a Soviet parade. Carolyn had laughed it off at the time. Now, alone in a mansion that felt like a prison, she wished she had listened. She wished she had paid attention to the small voice inside her that whispered something was wrong. When Caroline discovered she was pregnant, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe a baby would soften him. Maybe this was the fresh start they needed. Maybe the child growing inside her would unlock something tender in Ethan, something that had been buried beneath all that wealth and control. Instead, Ethan's grip tightened. He installed cameras throughout the house. For security, he explained, though the cameras seemed to follow her more than they watched the doors. He hired household staff who reported directly to him. Him as housekeeper, the cook, the gardener, all of them watching her, all of them taking notes. He tracked her car. He monitored her purchases. He read her text messages. He controlled every aspect of her existence until Caroline Hayes, the woman who had once saved children's lives, could not make a single decision without her husband's approval. And then came the night that changed everything. December 14th, Carolyn was 7 months pregnant. Snow had been falling since morning, covering the estate in a blanket of white that should have felt peaceful but instead felt like isolation. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles away. The nearest town was 15 minutes by car. She was surrounded by beauty and completely alone. That evening, she made a mistake. While Ethan was on a business call in his office, door closed, voice muffled, Caroline picked up the house landline. She had not spoken to her father in 3 weeks. 3 weeks of silence, of wondering if he was okay, of missing his voice so much her chest ached. She just wanted to hear him. Just for a moment, just to feel less alone. The phone rang twice before Richard answered. "Sweetheart," he said, and the sound of his voice nearly broke her. "Hi, Dad," she whispered. "I only have a minute." They talked for 4 minutes, 4 precious minutes where she felt like herself again. Richard told her about a contract he was working on. She told him about the baby's kicks, how strong they were getting, how she sometimes felt like she was carrying a future soccer player. They laughed quietly together, and for those 4 minutes, Caroline remembered what happiness felt like. She did not know Ethan had the line monitored. He found her in the living room 20 minutes later. She was sitting by the window, watching the snow fall, one hand resting on her belly. The baby was calm now, sleeping perhaps, and she was thinking about names. Maybe Richard, after her father. Maybe something else entirely. She had not decided yet. Ethan appeared in the doorway. His face was calm, terrifyingly calm, the kind of calm that preceded storms. "You called your father," he said. It was not a question. Carolyn's heart stopped. Her hand pressed harder against her belly, an instinctive gesture of protection. "I just wanted to," she began. "You disobeyed me," Ethan interrupted. His voice was soft, almost gentle. That made it worse. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and grabbed her arm. His fingers dug into her flesh, hard enough to leave bruises she would see for days. He pulled her to her feet and dragged her toward the back door. The December air hit her like a physical assault. The temperature was well below freezing. Her breath came out in visible clouds. Snow crunched beneath her slippers, and she realized with horror that she was not dressed for this. A thin sweater, leggings, slippers meant for walking on heated floors, not frozen marble. The outdoor shower stood in the center of the courtyard. It was meant for summer afternoons by the pool, for rinsing off chlorine after a swim, for cooling down on hot days. Now it stood like a steel skeleton surrounded by ice. Its metal frame glittered with frost. "Ethan, please," Carolyn begged. Her voice cracked. Her teeth had already begun to chatter. "I am pregnant. It is freezing. Please," he ignored her. He reached the shower and flicked the control valve with one practiced motion. Water blasted out. The pipes were heated internally, so the water itself was not frozen. But the moment it hit the freezing air, it became a frigid torrent that steamed white at the edges. Ethan turned to face her. His expression held nothing. No anger, no guilt, no humanity. "Step under the water," he commanded. Carolyn shook her head. She could not speak. Terror had stolen her voice. Ethan grabbed her wrist and shoved her forward. Her feet slid on the icy marble. Before she could steady herself, the freezing water crashed down on her shoulders. She screamed. The shock ripped through her body like electricity. Her breath disappeared. Her lungs locked tight. Every inch of her skin felt stabbed by 1,000 needles. The thin sweater soaked instantly and clung to her body like a sheet of ice. And the nightmare had only begun. The water was violence. That was the only way Caroline could describe it later. Not cold, not uncomfortable. Violence. Every drop felt like a blade. Her lungs refused to expand. Her vision blurred white at the edges. She collapsed to her knees and the marble beneath her was slick with ice, cold enough to burn. "Stand up," Ethan commanded from somewhere above her. "This is what happens when you disobey." She tried. God help her, she tried. Her legs would not cooperate. Her muscles had stopped responding to her brain's desperate commands. The baby kicked frantically inside her, a violent protest against the shock, and that kick was the only thing that kept her conscious. My baby, she thought. I have to protect my baby. But her body was shutting down. Hypothermia does not wait. It does not negotiate. It simply takes. First the fingers go numb, then the toes, then the lips, then the core. And once the core begins to fail, the body prioritizes survival over everything else, including the life growing inside. Medical experts would later note that hypothermia in pregnant women is particularly dangerous because the body redirects blood flow away from the extremities, including the uterus, to protect vital organs. Carolyn's situation that night was a textbook case of life-threatening maternal distress. If you are ever with someone showing signs of hypothermia, do not wait. Call for help immediately. Warm them gradually. Never assume they are okay just because they are conscious. Carolyn fell forward onto her hands. The water pounded her back, her neck, her head. She could not breathe. She could not think. She could only feel the cold invading her bones, her blood, her soul. "Please," she gasped. The word barely made it past her frozen lips. "Please stop." Ethan watched with his arms crossed. His expression held mild annoyance, like she was a misbehaving pet rather than his pregnant wife dying in front of him. "You are overreacting," he said. "A little cold never killed anyone." But he was wrong. Cold kills thousands every year. Cold does not care about wealth or status or power. Cold is the great equalizer, and that night, it was coming for Caroline Hayes with merciless efficiency. She tried to crawl away from the direct spray. Her palms slipped on the ice. Her knees buckled. She collapsed onto her side, and the marble pressed against her cheek like a frozen blade. The water kept coming. The cold kept consuming. The baby kicked again, weaker this time. "Hold on," Carolyn whispered to her son. "Please hold on." What she did not know, what Ethan did not know, was that she was wearing something more powerful than any weapon. A simple medical bracelet on her left wrist, hidden beneath her soaked sleeve. Her father had given it to her when she announced her pregnancy. "Just in case," he had said, pressing it into her palm. "It monitors your vitals and sends me an alert if anything seems wrong. It is not expensive. It is not complicated. But it could save your life someday." She had almost thrown it away. Ethan hated anything that connected her to her father. He had made her donate most of her personal belongings, claiming they did not fit the aesthetic of his home. But something had made her keep the bracelet. Something had made her wear it every day, hidden beneath long sleeves, hidden from his cameras and his control. Now, as her body temperature plummeted below the critical threshold, the bracelet's sensors activated. Her heart rate had become dangerously erratic. Her skin temperature had dropped to levels consistent with severe hypothermic shock. A silent distress signal shot out into the December night. It carried her GPS coordinates, her vital signs, and a timestamp. The message traveled through cellular networks at the speed of light, crossing 12 miles in a fraction of a second. At 9:47 that evening, Richard Hayes received an alert that would change everything. But Carolyn knew none of this. She only knew she was dying. Her vision had narrowed to a tunnel. The edges of the world were going dark. She could no longer feel her hands or her feet or her face. The only sensation left was the tight pressure in her abdomen where her baby fought to survive. She managed one final act of defiance. With the last of her strength, she pressed her palm against her belly. Not to save herself. She was beyond that now. But to let her son know in whatever way an unborn child can understand that his mother had tried, that his mother had fought. "I love you," she whispered to him. "I am so sorry." Then Caroline Hayes collapsed face down on the frozen marble, and the world went silent. Ethan sighed, actually sighed, like she had ruined his evening. "Get up, Caroline," he said, nudging her with his foot. "You are embarrassing yourself." She did not move. He nudged her again, harder this time. Nothing. For the first time that night, something flickered across his face, not concern for her, not guilt for what he had done. Fear. Fear for himself. Dead wives asked questions. Dead wives brought investigations. Dead wives were bad for business. He crouched down and pressed 2 fingers to her neck. Her pulse was there, weak and thready, but present. "Dramatic as always," he muttered. He turned off the water and walked back toward the mansion to get a towel. He would clean her up, put her to bed. Tomorrow she would apologize for overreacting, and everything would go back to normal. That was his plan. He had no idea that 12 miles away, 6 armored SUVs were already tearing through the night. He had no idea that a father's rage was bearing down on him with the force of a hurricane. He had no idea that his perfect life, built on money and cruelty and control, was about to be demolished completely. Ethan Miller believed he was untouchable. In exactly 17 minutes, he would learn how wrong he was. The courtyard fell silent except for the soft whistle of wind and the faint sound of Caroline's breathing, shallow and irregular. Frost began forming on her wet hair. Her skin had turned a terrifying shade of blue. The baby inside her had stopped kicking. Above her, the security cameras mounted on the mansion's exterior recorded everything. They captured Ethan forcing her into the water. They captured her collapse. They captured his indifference. They captured the 11 minutes he stood there watching before he decided she had been punished enough. The cameras were connected to the estate's central security system, which was connected to backup servers, which automatically uploaded footage to encrypted cloud storage. Ethan had installed this system himself. Paranoid about corporate espionage, about business rivals, about anyone who might threaten his empire. He never considered that the system would capture his own crimes. He never imagined that the security he had built to protect himself would become the weapon that destroyed him. The footage would eventually be seen by millions, every frame analyzed, every second dissected. The internet would rage. News anchors would express disbelief. Women's advocacy groups would demand justice. Politicians would issue statements. But all of that was still to come. For now, there was only the cold, only the silence, only a pregnant woman lying motionless on frozen marble while her husband walked away to get a towel, and somewhere in the darkness, the sound of engines, getting closer, getting louder. Richard Hayes was coming, and hell was coming with him. 12 miles away, Richard Hayes sat in his home office reviewing security contracts when his phone exploded with alerts. The screen displayed information that made his blood freeze. Caroline's vitals. Body temperature dropping rapidly. Heart rate erratic. GPS location locked on Ethan Miller's estate. The medical bracelet he had given her was transmitting distress signals that painted a picture of catastrophic physical failure. Richard did not hesitate. He did not call for clarification. He did not waste a single second on doubt. He had spent 30 years preparing for moments exactly like this. First in the military, where he learned that hesitation killed faster than bullets. Then protecting other people's families, where he learned that the difference between life and death often came down to response time. Tonight, he would protect his own. He activated his team with a single phrase broadcast through the secure communications system they use for emergency operations. Protocol 7, my daughter. Move now. Within 90 seconds, 6 vehicles carrying 12 of his best operatives were en route. These were not ordinary security guards. They were former military, former law enforcement, former intelligence operatives. They had worked together for years. They trusted each other with their lives. Richard grabbed his coat and ran to his car. His hands were steady, his mind was clear. But beneath the professional calm, a father's rage burned with white-hot intensity. If she is dead, he thought as he gunned the engine, I will end him. The convoy tore through the December night at speeds that would have gotten them arrested under normal circumstances. Tonight, they did not care. Tonight, the only law that mattered was survival. Richard tracked Caroline's vitals on his phone as he drove. Her body temperature continued to fall. Her heart rate grew more erratic with each passing minute. He watched the numbers with the clinical detachment of a man who had seen death before, but inside, his heart was being torn apart. "Hold on, sweetheart," he whispered to the empty car. "I am coming. Just hold on." The convoy hit Ethan Miller's gates at 10:04 in the evening. The ornate iron barriers designed to impress visitors with their elegance and expense crumpled like aluminum foil under the lead vehicle's reinforced bumper. Sparks flew into the night. Alarms screamed from the security system. The SUVs roared into the courtyard in perfect formation, headlights cutting through the darkness like blades of white fire. Ethan Miller had just stepped back outside with a towel when the convoy arrived. He froze in the doorway, the towel dangling from his hand, his face slack with shock. 12 armed professionals poured out of the vehicles and surrounded him in seconds. They moved with lethal efficiency, the choreography of operators who had rehearsed tactical formations thousands of times. "What the hell is this?" Ethan demanded, his voice high with panic. "This is my property. I will have you all arrested." Nobody responded. Two operatives positioned themselves between Ethan and Caroline's motionless body. Four others rushed to her side with medical equipment they had brought for exactly this scenario. The team leader, a woman named Sergeant Diana Lawson, knelt beside Caroline and checked her vitals. Diana was a 15-year veteran who had served 3 combat tours before joining Richard's firm. She had seen soldiers die of exposure in mountain passes. She had treated hypothermia victims in conditions that would break most people. She knew exactly what she was looking at. "Hypothermic shock," she reported into her radio, her voice calm but urgent. "Pulse weak, breathing shallow, possible fetal distress. We need immediate evac." Thermal blankets wrapped around Caroline's body. Warming packs were placed at her core under her arms against her neck. An oxygen mask covered her face. Every action was precise, practiced, professional. And then Richard Hayes stepped out of the final vehicle. The moment seemed to stretch. The courtyard lights illuminated his face, revealing an expression that combined cold fury with something far more dangerous. This was not just anger. This was the look of a man who had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Ethan's face went pale. Richard walked slowly across the courtyard, his boots crunching on the icy marble. He did not rush. He did not need to. The situation was already under control. His daughter was being saved. Now came the reckoning. He stopped directly in front of Ethan, close enough to smell his expensive cologne, close enough to see the fear flickering behind his arrogant mask. "You have 5 seconds," Richard said quietly, "to tell me why my daughter is lying unconscious in the snow." Ethan's voice cracked. She slipped. She was being dramatic. "I was getting a towel to help her." Richard glanced at Sergeant Lawson. "Sir," she reported, "the courtyard cameras captured everything." He forced her into the shower and watched her collapse for approximately 11 minutes before attempting any assistance. One of the younger operatives would later admit that he had never seen anyone look at another human being the way Richard Hayes looked at Ethan Miller in that moment. It was like watching a wolf decide whether to eat a rabbit now or play with it first. The pure predatory assessment in those eyes was something the young man would never forget. Richard leaned close to Ethan's ear and whispered something that made the millionaire's legs buckle. Whatever words passed between them in that moment were never recorded, never repeated, never confirmed. But Ethan Miller did not speak again until his lawyer arrived 6 hours later. The operatives worked with quiet efficiency. Carolyn was stabilized, lifted onto a stretcher, loaded into one of the SUVs that had been converted into a mobile medical unit. Heating systems pumped warm air across her body. Monitors tracked her vitals. A former combat medic established an IV line to deliver warm fluids directly into her bloodstream. "Sir," Sergeant Lawson said to Richard, "she is stable enough for transport. We need to move now." Richard nodded. His eyes remained fixed on Ethan, who stood frozen between two operatives, his hands trembling at his sides. "What happens to him?" Lawson asked. Richard was silent for a long moment. The snow continued to fall around them, gentle and indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath it. "The police," Richard finally said. "Call them. Give them the footage. Let the system handle him." He turned and walked toward the vehicle carrying his daughter. At the door, he paused and looked back one final time. Ethan, he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard with perfect clarity, I want you to remember something. I am letting the law handle this because my daughter would want it that way. But if she dies, if my grandson dies, no law on earth will protect you from what comes next. He climbed into the vehicle and closed the door. The convoy departed, leaving Ethan Miller standing alone in his courtyard, surrounded by the evidence of his own cruelty, waiting for the sirens that were already approaching in the distance. He had believed himself untouchable. He was learning how wrong he had been. Carolyn regained consciousness in a private hospital room 3 hours later. The first thing she saw was her father's face, exhausted, tear-streaked, but present. He was sitting beside her bed, holding her hand, and the moment her eyes opened, something in his expression crumbled with relief. The first thing she felt was warmth, real warmth, the kind that sinks into your bones and reminds you that you are alive. The first thing she heard was the steady beeping of a fetal monitor, and that sound was more beautiful than any music she had ever known. The baby, she whispered, her voice cracking from disuse and cold damage. Is he okay? Richard squeezed her hand. His voice was thick when he answered. Strong heartbeat. They are monitoring him around the clock. But he is a fighter, just like his mother. Carolyn wept. The tears came without warning, without control, a flood of relief and terror and gratitude that had been building since the moment the first drop of freezing water hit her skin. She cried for herself. She cried for her son. She cried for the life she had almost lost in that frozen courtyard. Richard held her hand through all of it. He did not try to stop her tears or offer empty comfort. He simply stayed. He simply witnessed. Sometimes that is the greatest gift one person can give another. Over the next 2 days, everything seemed to fall into place. Ethan was arrested and charged with assault, reckless endangerment, and criminal abuse of a pregnant woman. The courtyard footage was entered into evidence, and the detective assigned to the case called it one of the most disturbing things he had seen in 20 years. The footage went viral within hours of Ethan's arrest. Someone at the police department leaked it, and the internet responded with volcanic fury. Hashtags trended worldwide. News networks ran the story on loop. Women's advocacy groups demanded maximum sentencing. Politicians issued statements condemning domestic violence. Miller Industries stock plummeted 23% as investors fled. Board members held emergency meetings. Analysts predicted the company might not survive the scandal. Caroline filed for divorce and a restraining order from her hospital bed. She signed the papers with a hand that still trembled from residual nerve damage, but her signature was clear and strong. 3 domestic violence organizations offered her pro bono legal support. Strangers sent flowers and cards and donations to charities in her name. For the first time in 18 months, Carolyn felt like she was not alone. Her case became a teaching example in the weeks that followed. Experts noted that her father's decision to give her the medical bracelet and her decision to wear it despite the risk demonstrated the importance of having a secret safety plan. If you are in a dangerous situation, find small ways to protect yourself. A phone hidden in your car, a code word arranged with a friend, a device that can send an alert without your abuser knowing. These small preparations can mean the difference between survival and tragedy. By day 3, Caroline allowed herself to believe the nightmare was over. She was wrong. The call came on day 4. Her lawyer, a public defender named James, who had been assigned to handle her case until permanent counsel could be arranged, arrived at her hospital room with an expression that made her stomach drop. Ethan made bail, he said. $2 million. He walked out this morning. Caroline's blood went cold. The monitors beside her bed spiked as her heart rate accelerated. How is that possible? The footage. His legal team is arguing that the footage was obtained through an illegal security breach. They claim your father's operatives entered the property without authorization and that any evidence collected should be inadmissible. But he almost killed me, I know. But if they successfully challenge the evidence, the assault charges could be dropped entirely. We are fighting it, but these things take time. Time. Carolyn almost laughed. Time was the one thing she did not have. She was stuck in a hospital bed, 7 months pregnant, while her abuser walked free and plotted his counterattack. It got worse. That afternoon, her obstetrician arrived with results from her latest tests. The hypothermic shock had caused complications, elevated stress hormones, early signs of preeclampsia. The doctor's face was grave as she explained what this meant. You need complete bed rest, she said. Any significant stress could endanger both you and the baby. I cannot emphasize this enough. Your body is already fighting to recover. You cannot give it additional battles. So Caroline was trapped, confined to bed while her abuser walked free, unable to fight, unable to run, unable to do anything except wait and hope that the system she had trusted would protect her. That night, alone in her childhood bedroom at her father's house where she had been transferred for recovery, Caroline stared at the ceiling and felt the familiar darkness closing in. He is going to win, she thought. He always wins. Money wins, power wins, and I am going to lose my baby because of him. She pressed her hand to her belly, where her son kicked weakly against her palm. I am sorry, she whispered to him. I am so sorry I brought you into this. Outside her window, snow was falling gently. Somewhere in the city, Ethan Miller was meeting with lawyers and PR consultants, strategizing his next move. Somewhere, judges were reviewing motions that could erase the evidence of his crimes. Somewhere, the machinery of wealth and influence was grinding into motion to protect a man who deserved only punishment. Carolyn had never felt so helpless. She had never felt so alone. She had never felt so certain that hope was a lie she could no longer afford to believe. This was her second peak of despair, and unlike the first, there was no rescue coming. No cavalry charging through the gates. No father bursting in to save her. There was only the darkness and the cold, and the growing certainty that some battles cannot be won. Or so she believed. Ethan Miller did not become a millionaire by accepting defeat. Within 48 hours of his release on bail, he launched a counter-narrative designed to destroy his wife's credibility and restore his tarnished reputation. The strategy was sophisticated, expensive, and utterly ruthless. First, he hired a PR crisis team that had previously rehabilitated a senator caught in a corruption scandal. These were professionals who specialized in making the guilty seem innocent, in spinning facts until truth became unrecognizable. Second, he gave an exclusive interview to a sympathetic journalist, painting himself as a concerned husband whose troubled wife had a history of exaggeration and mental instability. He spoke about her difficult childhood. He mentioned her mother's death. He implied, without directly stating, that Caroline's perception of reality could not be trusted. Third, his lawyers filed defamation suits against 3 news outlets that had called him an abuser. The lawsuits were designed not to win, but to intimidate, to make media organizations think twice before reporting critically on Ethan Miller. Fourth, he produced witnesses, household staff on his payroll who claimed they had seen Caroline harm herself, who claimed she was prone to dramatic outbursts, who claimed Ethan was actually a patient, loving husband driven to desperation by a wife who refused help. The PR team also suggested he adopt a rescue dog to improve his public image. He chose a golden retriever and named it Justice. The internet roasted him mercilessly for that choice. One viral post read, "That dog has better character than you and he eats his own vomit." But beneath the humor, Ethan's strategy was working. Public opinion began to shift. Some commentators questioned the rush to judgment. Others noted that we were only hearing one side. A few suggested that perhaps the footage had been taken out of context. Caroline watched from her bed as her abuser transformed himself into a victim. She saw the headlines changing. She saw the doubt creeping into conversations. She saw people who had supported her beginning to wonder if maybe she had exaggerated, if maybe things were not as clear as they seemed. Then came the 3 blows that nearly broke her completely. The first catastrophe arrived in the form of legal papers delivered to her father's house on a Tuesday morning. Ethan's lawyers had filed an emergency motion seeking custody of the unborn child, citing Caroline's mental instability and flight risk. They produced psychiatric evaluations from doctors she had never met, diagnosing her with conditions she did not have: bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, a tendency towards self-harm. The documents were lies, fabrications purchased with wealth and signed by professionals willing to sell their integrity. But they looked official, they looked real. And in family court, appearance often mattered more than truth. The second catastrophe came 2 days later. A judge, who would later be revealed to have received campaign contributions from Ethan's business associates, froze all divorce proceedings pending further investigation. This meant Caroline had no access to marital assets, no ability to hire her own lawyers, no resources except what her father could provide. Richard was comfortable, but he was not wealthy. Fighting Ethan Miller in court required the kind of money that security consultants did not have. Every legal filing cost thousands. Every hearing required experts. Every delay was another drain on resources they could not afford to lose. The third catastrophe was the betrayal that cut deepest. Caroline's best friend from nursing school, Diane, the woman who had joked about Soviet red flags, the woman who had held her hand through late-night study sessions and early morning shifts, sold her story to a tabloid. The article painted Caroline as a gold digger who had trapped Ethan with pregnancy and was now playing victim to secure a bigger divorce settlement. And by Nathan, it included personal details that only a close friend would know. It quoted text messages taken out of context. It portrayed Caroline as calculating, manipulative, and fundamentally dishonest. The money Diane received, $50,000. The cost of Caroline's trust, immeasurable. Caroline sat in her father's kitchen, staring at the tabloid headline, and felt something inside her shatter. The friend she had trusted for 15 years, the woman she had planned to make her baby's godmother, sold out for $50,000. "I cannot do this," she said flatly. Her voice held no emotion. She had moved beyond emotion into something colder, something hollow. "He is going to win. He is going to take my baby. I cannot not fight someone with that much money and that much power." Richard sat across from her, his face etched with helpless pain. "Carolyn," he began. "No." She pushed herself up from the table, ignoring the doctor's orders about bed rest. "I am done. I am so tired, Dad. I am tired of being afraid. I am tired of being hurt. I am tired of hoping things will get better when they just keep getting worse." She walked to the window and stared out at the falling snow. "Maybe he should win," she whispered. "Maybe I was never meant to be a mother anyway." There is a moment in every struggle when giving up seems not just reasonable, but inevitable. When the obstacles are so large and the resources so small, that continuing feels like foolishness rather than courage. Carolyn had reached that moment. She stood at the edge of surrender, looking down into the abyss, ready to let go. But sometimes, just when we are ready to quit, the universe sends us a reason to keep fighting. The next morning, her father received an encrypted email from an anonymous source. The subject line read, "Miller Industries Board Meeting, Confidential Recording," and everything was about to change. The recording was 47 minutes long. Richard played it on his laptop while Caroline sat beside him, wrapped in blankets despite the heated room, her hand resting on her belly where her son kicked with reassuring strength. They listened in silence as voices filled the room. Ethan's voice, and the voices of men Carolyn had never met, but whose words would ultimately destroy her husband's empire. The recording captured a private board meeting from 6 months earlier, before Caroline's pregnancy was announced, before the courtyard assault, before any public scandal. In it, Ethan discussed strategies that revealed the true nature of his character. He talked about managing his wife through isolation and financial control. He referred to weak women needing strong guidance. He explained his system for hiding asset transfers through offshore accounts, bragging about how clever he had been in protecting his wealth from potential divorce claims. And most damning of all, he casually mentioned paying off a previous girlfriend who had accused him of assault. "Just a cost of doing business," he called it. Women talk, money shuts them up. Carolyn listened with her hands shaking. She had known Ethan was cruel. She had known he was controlling. But hearing him speak about her, about women in general, with such calculated contempt was something else entirely. "This is who he really is," she said when the recording ended. "This is who he has always been." "Yes," Richard confirmed, "and he has been getting away with it. For years, maybe decades, probably." Carolyn was quiet for a long moment. Her son kicked against her palm, and she pressed back gently, letting him know she was there. "Who sent this?" she asked. Richard shook his head. "The email was routed through multiple proxies. Whoever sent it knows how to stay hidden. But they will find out. They always do. Ethan will investigate, and eventually someone will trace it back to the source. That is likely." Carolyn processed this information. Someone had taken an enormous risk to help her. Someone had access to Ethan's most private meetings and had chosen to expose him despite the personal danger that represented. It came from inside, she said slowly. It had to. Someone at Miller Industries. Someone close enough to record board meetings. Richard nodded. That is my assessment as well. Days later, Carolyn would learn the truth. The recording came from Ethan's own executive assistant, a quiet and efficient woman named Margaret Sullivan, who had worked for Miller Industries for 12 years. Margaret had witnessed Ethan's behavior behind closed doors since the day she was hired. She had seen how he treated subordinates, how he talked about women when he thought no one important was listening, how he bullied anyone who challenged his authority. She had stayed silent for over a decade because she needed the job. She had 2 children in college and a mother in assisted living. Speaking up meant risking everything. But when she saw the footage of Caroline collapsing in that freezing courtyard, something inside Margaret snapped. I could not live with myself, Margaret would later testify. I kept thinking, what if that was my daughter? What if nobody helped her? What if I stayed silent and he killed the next one? Margaret's decision to become a whistleblower and the legal protections that eventually shielded her would highlight the importance of corporate accountability laws. Her testimony would help strengthen whistleblower provisions in her state, making it easier for others to report abuse without fear of retaliation. But that was still to come. For now, all Caroline knew was that someone had given her a weapon, and she had a choice to make about how to use it. He has been doing this his whole life, she said quietly, to other women, to employees, to anyone he thought was weaker than him. Yes, and he is going to keep doing it, even if I disappear, even if I give up. He will find someone else to hurt. Probably. Carolyn placed both hands on her belly. Her son kicked once, twice, 3 times. Strong kicks, fighter's kicks. No, she said. Her voice had changed. Something had shifted behind her eyes. Something harder and fiercer than the woman who had stood at that window ready to surrender. Not while I am breathing. She looked at her father with an expression he had not seen since she was a stubborn teenager, determined to prove everyone wrong. I need your help, Dad. Not to rescue me. Not to fight my battles for me. To help me fight back. To help me destroy him. Richard Hayes smiled for the first time in weeks. That is my girl, he said. The counterattack began that day. Not a rescue, not a retreat, a war. Caroline's plan was methodical, strategic, and designed to be devastating. The first step was legal reinforcement. She needed a lawyer who could match Ethan's team, who had experience taking down wealthy abusers, who was not afraid of the kind of money and influence he could deploy. Richard made calls. He spoke to contacts he had developed over decades in the security industry. He asked questions, gathered recommendations, and eventually identified the person they needed. Victoria Chambers was a legendary attorney known in legal circles as the Hammer. She had never lost a domestic violence case. She had taken down corporate executives, politicians, and celebrities. Her fee was astronomical, beyond anything Caroline could afford. But Victoria saw something in Caroline's case that intrigued her. The evidence was strong. The villain was obvious. The platform was massive. When we win, Victoria said during their first meeting, and we will win, I take my fee from his assets. Consider it karmic redistribution. The second step was evidence compilation. The anonymous recording was powerful, but Victoria wanted more. She hired investigators who specialized in corporate malfeasance, and what they uncovered painted a picture of systematic abuse stretching back years. 2 previous settlements with women who had accused Ethan of assault, both buried under non-disclosure agreements. Financial records showing complex asset hiding schemes that constituted fraud. Testimony from former employees describing a pattern of workplace abuse, bullying, and intimidation. Text messages where Ethan explicitly threatened Carolyn, messages he thought had been deleted, but which forensic specialists recovered from cloud backups. The third step was media strategy. Instead of hiding, instead of letting Ethan control the narrative, Caroline went public on her own terms. She gave one interview to a respected journalist known for careful, accurate reporting. She told her complete story without embellishment or dramatics. Just facts. Just truth. Just a woman explaining exactly what had happened to her and why she was fighting back. During the interview, the journalist asked how she was coping. Caroline paused for a moment, then answered with unexpected honesty. Well, I have discovered that stress eating ice cream while on bed rest is actually a legitimate medical strategy. My doctor did not exactly approve, but he did not disapprove either. The clip went viral, not because it was particularly funny, but because it showed a real human being surviving an impossible situation with grace and resilience. People responded to her humanity, her refusal to be either victim or saint. The tide began to turn. The judge who had frozen her divorce proceedings was investigated for corruption after journalists discovered his financial ties to Ethan's business network. He was forced to recuse himself. A new judge with no connections to either party took over the case. Ethan's PR campaign collapsed when the anonymous recording leaked to the press. The audio of him discussing managing his wife and paying off accusers was impossible to spin. His concerned husband image shattered overnight. Miller Industries board voted unanimously to remove him as CEO, citing conduct incompatible with the company's values and commitment to ethical business practices. His own lawyers began distancing themselves, citing irreconcilable differences in statements carefully crafted to protect their reputations while abandoning their client. By week 3 of Caroline's counterattack, Ethan Miller was facing criminal charges that his legal team could not dismiss, stripped of his corporate position, hemorrhaging money on legal fees, and abandoned by almost everyone who had once sought his favor. Caroline allowed herself to feel something like victory. Then Ethan played his final card. The phone call came at 2 in the morning. Caroline was sleeping restlessly when her father knocked on her door, his face grim. "You need to take this," he said, handing her his phone. "Mrs. Miller," said the voice on the other end. "This is Detective Morrison. We need you to come to the station immediately. There has been a development." "What kind of development?" "It is better if we discuss this in person." At the police station, Detective Morrison led her to an interview room where Victoria Chambers was already waiting. The attorney's expression told Caroline everything she needed to know. Something had gone wrong. "Ethan filed a report tonight," Victoria said. "He is claiming that your father's security team assaulted him during the rescue operation. He has medical documentation of injuries consistent with being restrained. Bruises, abrasions, a fractured wrist." Caroline felt ice forming in her stomach. "They saved my life, I know. But here is the problem." Victoria slid a photograph across the table. "One of your father's operatives, Sergeant Lawson, was captured on a neighbor's security camera striking Ethan after you were loaded into the vehicle." Caroline stared at the image. Diana Lawson, the woman who had knelt beside her in the snow and fought to save her life, was clearly shown punching Ethan in the face. "She was defending me," Caroline whispered. "The law does not see it that way. Your rescue team used force to enter private property. They restrained a homeowner without police authority, and now there is evidence of assault. Ethan's lawyers are filing charges against your father and his entire team." The room seemed to spin. Everything they had fought for, everything they had built, was crumbling again. "If these charges stick," Victoria continued, "everything changes. Your father could face prison time. The rescue gets reframed as a home invasion, and Ethan's lawyers will argue that you orchestrated a violent attack against your husband using your father's private army. It destroys our narrative completely." Caroline felt the familiar darkness pressing in at the edges of her vision. The walls closing, the air thinning, another false victory destroyed by another devastating twist. But this time something different rose to meet the darkness. Not despair, rage. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet but carried an edge that made both Victoria and Detective Morrison look at her with new attention. "No," she repeated. "He does not get to flip this. He does not get to make my father, the man who saved my life, into a criminal while he walks free." She stood up, her hands flat on the table, her eyes blazing. "There has to be something, some way to prove who he really is. Some evidence that cannot be challenged or dismissed or spun." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her words were careful. "There might be, but you are not gonna like it. Tell me." "According to our source, Margaret, Ethan keeps physical copies of every NDA, every settlement, every piece of evidence that could incriminate him in a safe in his home office. He is paranoid about digital security, so he maintains paper backups of everything damaging. So we need to get into that safe. We need someone to get into that safe. Someone with legal access to the property. Someone whose presence would not trigger suspicion. Carolyn understood immediately. The realization hit her like a physical blow, but she did not flinch from it. You want me to go back? You are still legally his wife. You have a right to access the marital home. If you could get into that safe, retrieve the documents, photograph them. I am 7 months pregnant and on bed rest. My doctor said any significant stress could endanger the baby. I know. Victoria's voice was gentle but honest. That is why I said you would not like it. Caroline closed her eyes. She thought about her baby. She thought about her father facing prison. She thought about every woman Ethan had hurt and every woman he would hurt in the future if he won. When she opened her eyes, her decision was made. When do we go? The operation was planned with military precision. Caroline would enter the mansion under the pretext of retrieving personal belongings, something her lawyers had been negotiating for weeks. Ethan, believing he had the upper hand with his assault charges against her father, had agreed to a supervised visit. The supervision would come from his own lawyers and a court-appointed mediator. Caroline's father and his team were explicitly barred from the property as a condition of the visit. You will be alone in there, Richard said the night before. His voice was tight with fear. If something goes wrong, I cannot protect you. I know, Dad. He could hurt you. He could hurt the baby, and there would be nothing I could do. Caroline placed her hand on his cheek, feeling the rough stubble, seeing the lines that worry had carved around his eyes. I am not the same woman who walked into that courtyard, she said. He broke something in me that night, that is true, but something stronger grew in its place. Domestic violence experts would later use Caroline's case to illustrate a critical point about leaving abusers. The departure period is often the most dangerous time for a victim. This is when abusers feel their control slipping. This is when they are most likely to escalate to severe or lethal violence. Planning, preparation, and having a support system in place can mean the difference between escape and tragedy. Carolyn's success in what followed was not luck. It was strategy. The mansion looked different when Caroline arrived the next morning. The marble floors that had once seemed elegant now felt cold and sterile. The artwork that had once impressed her now looked like expensive camouflage for an empty soul. The gardens where she had once walked were bare and frozen. The pool where they had spent summer afternoons was covered and abandoned. This had been her home. This had been her prison. Now it would become the site of her final confrontation. Ethan greeted her at the door with a smile that made her skin crawl. Caroline, he said, you look well. Pregnancy suits you. She did not respond. She could not trust her voice. Speaking to him felt like touching something toxic. The mediator, a bored-looking woman named Patricia, explained the rules. Caroline could collect clothing, personal items, and documents. She would be accompanied at all times. Any attempt to remove items not on the pre-approved list would result in immediate termination of the visit. Understood, Caroline said. For the first 40 minutes, she played her part perfectly. She gathered clothes from her closet. She collected photographs from the living room. She made small talk with Patricia about due dates and baby names. Throughout it all, Ethan watched from the doorway of each room, his arms crossed, his lips curved in a knowing smirk. He believed he had already won. He believed this visit was just a formality before he destroyed her completely. At the 50-minute mark, Caroline made her move. I need to use the bathroom, she told Patricia. This baby is pressing on everything. Patricia nodded sympathetically. Of course, I will wait here. Caroline walked toward the guest bathroom. At the last moment, she turned left instead of right and slipped into Ethan's home office. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had maybe 2 minutes before someone noticed her absence. Maybe less. The safe was behind a painting, obvious and predictable, exactly where Margaret had described. A landscape oil painting worth more than most people's cars, hiding the vault where Ethan kept his darkest secrets. The combination was his birthday. Of course it was. Men like him always used their own birthdays. Their egos would not allow anything else. Carolyn punched in the numbers with trembling fingers. The safe clicked open. Inside, she found folders. Dozens of folders. NDAs from women she had never heard of. Settlement agreements with amounts that made her stomach turn. Photographs of injuries. Recordings of conversations. Financial documents showing transfers to accounts in countries with strict banking secrecy. And something else. something that made her blood freeze. A folder labeled with her name. Inside was a life insurance policy she had never signed, dated 2 months before the courtyard incident. The beneficiary was Ethan Miller. The payout was $15 million. Her signature on the policy was a perfect forgery. He had not just tried to hurt her. He had been planning to kill her. Caroline's hands shook as she photographed everything with her phone. Every page, every document, every piece of evidence. The photos uploaded automatically to a secure cloud server that Victoria had set up. She was on the last folder when the door opened. Ethan stood in the doorway. His smile was gone. His eyes were cold and hard and dangerous. "What do you think you are doing?" he said. Caroline did not run. She did not cower. She did not beg. She stood her ground and looked directly at the man who had tried to destroy her. "I found your insurance policy," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands had stopped shaking. "The one with my forged signature. The one that pays out $15 million when I die." Ethan's face went pale, then red with fury. "You broke into my safe. That is theft. That is trespassing. I will have you arrested." "What is it?" Caroline interrupted. "Illegal. Like forcing your pregnant wife into freezing water. Like paying off assault victims. Like planning to murder me for insurance money." She held up her phone. "I have photographs of everything. Every settlement you have ever paid. Every NDA you have ever forced someone to sign. Every piece of evidence you have been hoarding for years." Ethan took a step toward her. His hands were clenched at his sides. Violence radiated from him like heat from a flame. "Give me that phone." "No," he took another step. "I said give me that phone. Now." Caroline did not move. "You can hit me. You can hurt me. You have done it before, but that phone is already backing up to a cloud server. Everything I photographed is already in the hands of my lawyer, and there are witnesses in this house. Patricia is down the hall. Your own lawyers are in the living room." She took a breath. "And unlike that night in the courtyard, I am ready for you now." Ethan's face contorted with rage. For a moment, Caroline genuinely believed he might attack her anyway, that he might sacrifice everything, his freedom, his reputation, his future, just to hurt her one more time. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the certainty in her eyes. Maybe it was the realization that the game had changed. Maybe it was simply the calculation of a man who had spent his whole life measuring risk against reward. "Also," Caroline added, because even in this moment she refused to let him see her fear, "I am 7 months pregnant and my center of gravity is completely shot. So if you knock me down, I am absolutely taking that Ming vase with me on the way to the floor. And I know how much you paid for that thing." For one suspended moment, neither of them moved. Then footsteps sounded in the hallway. Patricia appeared in the doorway, followed by one of Ethan's lawyers. "What is going on here?" Patricia demanded. Caroline stepped past Ethan, close enough that she could have touched him, and handed her phone to the mediator. "I would like to add some items to my list of retrieved belongings," she said. "Specifically evidence of insurance fraud, witness tampering, and conspiracy to commit murder." What followed was the complete and total destruction of Ethan Miller. The photographs Caroline captured were shared with prosecutors within hours. The forged life insurance policy alone was enough to add attempted murder charges to his case. The pattern of settlements revealed a serial predator who had been operating for over a decade. The previous assault victims, freed from their NDAs by the evidence of criminal fraud that voided those agreements, came forward one by one, 3 women at first, then 5, then 8, each telling stories that echoed Caroline's experience, each proving that she was not the first, merely the one who had survived to fight back. Miller Industries' remaining board members released a statement condemning their former CEO and pledging full cooperation with investigators. The company's stock, already damaged, collapsed completely. Shareholders filed suit. Creditors demanded repayment. The empire Ethan had spent decades building crumbled in days. The charges against Richard Hayes and his team were dropped when prosecutors realized that pursuing them would require Ethan to testify, and his testimony would expose his entire criminal history. The assault charge against Sergeant Lawson was dismissed as justified defense of a third party. But the final blow came from an unexpected source. Diane, the friend who had sold Caroline's story, came forward with evidence of her own. The tabloid deal had not been her idea. Ethan had threatened her. He had discovered she was having an affair and used it as leverage. He told me if I did not give that interview, he would destroy my marriage and my career, Diane testified through tears. But after I saw what Caroline did, how she stood up to him when I could not, I knew I had to tell the truth, even if it destroys me. Caroline forgave her. Not easily, not completely, but enough. Because she understood now that Ethan's cruelty had touched more lives than she had ever imagined, and that healing would require more than just punishment. It would require grace. 6 months later, Ethan Miller stood in a courtroom and heard the words that ended his empire. Guilty of assault, guilty of reckless endangerment, guilty of insurance fraud, guilty of witness tampering, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Total sentence, 47 years. Carolyn watched from the gallery with her son sleeping peacefully in her arms. She had named him Richard after her father. The baby was 3 months old now, healthy and strong, with his mother's eyes and his grandfather's stubborn chin. When the verdict was read, Caroline felt something she had not expected. Nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, no relief, just a quiet sense of completion, like finishing a book that had taken too long to read. The monster was caged. Her son was safe. Her life was her own again. In her victim impact statement, delivered before the sentencing, Carolyn had addressed the court and through the cameras addressed women everywhere who might be facing what she had faced. If you are watching this and you are trapped in a situation like mine, please know that escape is possible. Document everything. Tell someone you trust. Make a safety plan. And remember that his money, his power, his threats, none of it is stronger than your will to survive. I am living proof. After the trial, after the cameras stopped rolling and the reporters stopped calling, Carolyn received a letter. It was from Margaret Sullivan, the whistleblower who had started everything with that anonymous recording. Dear Caroline, the letter began, I never told you why I really sent that recording. It was not just because I saw the courtyard footage, though that was certainly the final push I needed. It was because of something that happened 12 years ago when I first started working for Ethan. There was another woman before you. Her name was Sarah. She tried to leave him. He told everyone she was crazy, unstable, dangerous. He had her committed to a psychiatric facility. He used his money and his influence to keep her there. She died in that facility 3 years later. The official cause was suicide. I have always believed he killed her. I just could never prove it. When I saw you in that courtyard, I saw Sarah, and I decided that this time I would not stay silent. You did not just save yourself, Carolyn. You got justice for someone who never had a chance to fight back. Thank you. Carolyn read the letter 3 times. Then she walked to her son's nursery, picked him up from his crib, and held him against her chest. He stirred slightly, making the soft sounds that newborns make, then settled back into sleep. We are going to be okay, she whispered to him. All of us. 1 year after the verdict, Caroline Hayes stood on the stage of a domestic violence awareness conference, looking out at an audience of 1,000 faces. Behind her, a banner read, From Survivor to Advocate. A year ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the speakers. I was lying on a frozen marble floor, convinced I was going to die. I had no power, no resources, no hope. A man I trusted had tried to destroy me, and for a while I believed he would succeed. She paused, letting the silence hold weight. In the front row, her father sat with baby Richard on his lap. Beside him sat Margaret Sullivan, who had become a friend. Beside her sat Victoria Chambers, who had become an ally for life. But I am standing here today because of something Ethan never understood. Power is not money. Power is not control. Power is not the ability to hurt people who are weaker than you. She looked out at the audience, at the faces of women who were trapped, and women who had escaped, and women who were fighting right now. Power is the choice to keep going, even when every part of you wants to surrender. Power is asking for help when you cannot fight alone. Power is believing that you deserve to serve, even when someone has spent years convincing you otherwise. She took a breath. I had help. I had a father who gave me a bracelet that saved my life. I had a stranger who risked everything to tell the truth. I had a lawyer who believed me when others did not. I had a community that rallied around me when I could not rally around myself. But the choice to fight, that was mine. And it can be yours too. The final piece of wisdom she shared that day would be quoted for years afterward, printed on posters and shared in support groups, and repeated by advocates around the world. If you are in danger, reach out. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They believe you. They can help. You are not alone, and you are so much stronger than you know. Carolyn stepped back from the podium as the audience rose to their feet. The applause washed over her like warm water, healing something that had been cold for too long. Outside the conference center, snow was falling gently, the same snow that had covered the courtyard on the worst night of her life. But this time, it felt different. This time, it felt like a blank page. Carolyn walked out into the winter air, her father beside her, her son in her arms. The snow landed on her cheeks and melted there, cold but somehow welcoming. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the love that had been a lie, the marriage that had been a cage, the courtyard that had nearly been her grave, the fight that had become her salvation. She thought about Sarah, the woman she had never met but whose justice she had helped secure. She thought about Margaret, who had risked everything to do the right thing. She thought about Diane, who had failed and then found the courage to make it right. She thought about all the women watching her story unfold, wondering if escape was possible for them. "It is," she said quietly to the falling snow. "It is possible. I promise," and on. Richard touched her arm gently. "Ready to go home." Caroline looked at her father, at the man who had never stopped believing in her, who had given her the tools to save herself, who had taught her that love was not control, but freedom. "Yes," she said, "I am ready." They walked together through the snow, 3 generations of Hayes moving toward a future that was finally, truly theirs. Behind them, the conference center lights glowed warm against the winter darkness. Ahead of them, the road stretched clean and white in waiting. And somewhere in the falling snow, a story ended. Not with a whisper, not with a scream, with a choice. The choice to survive, the choice to fight, the choice to believe that tomorrow could be better than today. That is the power no one can take from you. That is the power that destroys monsters. That is the power of a woman who refuses to break. If this story moved you, if it made you angry, if it made you think about someone you know who might need to hear this, drop a comment below and tell me what you think. Your comments help more people find stories like this one, stories that need to be told, stories that might help someone realize they are not alone. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message today, share this video with them, because sometimes a single story can change a life. Now let us begin.